Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks Podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Lennard Zinn. Lennard Zinn is a bike designer and frame builder with a shop in Louisville, Colorado. He was a member of the U.S. Olympic cycling team and worked with Tom Ritchey on some of the earliest mountain bikes. He's also the author of Zinn and the Art of MTB Maintenance, which is one of the world's best-selling guides to mountain bike repair. Thanks for joining me, Lennard.
Thank you.
So tell us a bit about your background. How'd you get into designing and building bikes?
Well, as you said, I was on national cycling team, and once that happens, you generally have sponsors providing you with your equipment. And I had won there's a race, the Iron Horse Classic in Durango, and the classic, it's a stage race, but the main event is the race from Durango to Silverton, where you're actually racing it's called the Iron Horse because you're racing the narrow gauge train that's famous.
Oh, cool.
Silverton. And I won that race in 1980, and I set the course record by like more than 5 minutes. And so I was, kind of a heavy favorite to win it again in 81. But by then, I was on a little tiny team in 1980 when I won it. And so now I was, on a strong trade team and had a sponsor provided bike that I just got.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two 11,000 foot passes in that stage. And coming down the backside of the first pass, my bike just started shaking uncontrollably.
Oh no.
And, there was nothing I could do except put the brakes on and just let the group go. And then the same thing happened on the even steeper descent down into Silverton after the second climb.
Oh man.
And it was sort of at that moment that, I used to make jewelry when I was in high school. And then when I was in college, I actually taught jewelry making with the leisure program at Colorado College. And I had a degree in physics. I'd done my senior seminar on the stability of a bicycle. I'd written these computer program in this, ancient computer language called Fortran about determining the stability of a bike. And so I figured I had the craft from jewelry making to be able to do it, and that I had knowledge and interest from my physics background to be able to do it as well. And so I was like, that's when I decided, I could make a better bike than this myself. So that's what sort of started the whole process. And I didn't actually, I guess I'd already had started. I'd made one bike in the year after I graduated from college. While I was training at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, I was also working in the physics department at Colorado College as the paraprofessional. And in those days you won a lot of bike parts, not a lot of, because you didn't win much money. And I really wanted my girlfriend, who's now my wife of 39 years, to have a nice bike. And so I built her a frame while I was in the physics shop there. And then I had Bill Woodall, who was this really famous mechanic of the national team. I had him help me with all the finishing stuff over at the Olympic Training Center and put all those parts that I'd won over time on the bike. So I had that little experience of this one thing of making this frame. And then really what happened was late in that season in 1981, I tore my gastrocnemius muscle racing in the Tour of Ireland stage race.
Oh, wow.
And after I got back from Ireland, it just got worse and worse and worse. Calcified and stuff. And I couldn't stand being around Boulder, where everything for me was, other than my girlfriend, was about bikes, and I moved to Northern California and started working for a geophysics company, got laid off, and then just was flipping through the phone book and saw Tom Ritchey's name, and I called him up, and just so happened that his second employee ever had quit that day. And so I became an employee ever. And
Wow.
me and this guy, Devin and Tom, we made 100 frames a month. And that was, I'd heard about mountain bikes, but I'd never seen them. But, you know, Ritchey was the only one making that kind of scale of mountain bikes in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, you know, I learned an enormous amount from him. And he's, you know, he's a good friend, and he's only a year older than me or something. It's just that he'd started his company when he was 16. So
Oh, wow.
we last October went out to his place for celebrating the 50th anniversary of Ritchey bicycles, whereas this past summer we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Zinn cycles. So,
Oh, wow.
same age. He just started his business a lot sooner. And
Yeah.
anyway, in order to heal this knee injury, it just wasn't healing out there in California anyway. So I came back to Boulder to be treated by Andy Pruitt, who's famous in the bike world as the sort of the orthopedist of cycling elite, and the bike fitter who trained everything, you know, who created what Retool came out of, and all the bike fitting systems basically are based on Andy Pruitt's work. And so, and my grandmother left me $10,000 when she died about that same time. And I used that to start Zinn Cycles, and never really thought it would become a career, but wanted to build some bikes, and ended up, you know, being a 40 years now, almost 41 years into it.
Yeah, that's great. So Zinn and the Art of Mountain Bike Maintenance was first published in 1996. And from what I see, it's now in the 6th edition. What's changed over the years in the book?
Well, a lot.
Yeah.
First wrote the book, 1996. So I remember the cover. The cover of that one, the first edition, was the only one that had a picture of me on it. The other ones are all just a picture of a bike.
Really?
And that, I was holding an early, like, RockShox Judy suspension fork. So suspension forks had just come in. So that was one reason to write the book, because nobody how to work on those. But otherwise, you know, you had cantilever brakes. There was certainly no rear suspension. I don't think there were even any carbon bikes. All bikes were made out of metal, you know, or a few titanium. Yeah. Basically steel and aluminum was where it was at. There was no such thing as a threadless headset at the time. It was threaded headset with a stem with a quill.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of changes. Would you say today's bikes are easier to work on than they were 10 or 20 years ago, or are things getting more complicated?
Well, it depends on if you actually want to completely overhaul things. Like at the time, you know, there was no such thing as like one of these cranks now, you know, the crank arm and the spindle are one piece. And then, you know, it's a sealed bearing in the bottom bracket. And at that time it was all loose ball bearings and, you know, separate crank arms. And so those were harder to work on in the sense that you needed more tools in order to take them apart. But but you could completely take everything apart down to, you know, now you just replace the bearing in a cartridge bearing, or even, you don't even a lot of times do that. You replace the entire bottom bracket, the whole cups with the bearings in them. So you don't have the ability to work on the individual parts. Also, you know, a lot of, like a cantilever brake, you could replace individual pieces of the cantilever brake. And now, like modern disc brakes, you're not even allowed to get into that other than tape. You know, they're even designed that you can't really overhaul much of anything inside them. You just can change the pads and stuff. So, and then of course, electronic shifting, and even the STI, because 96, I guess there was click shifting already then, but those were thumb shifters, you know, on the mountain bike that you could, but you really don't do that anymore. You kind of replace the shifter and
right. Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, things are easier because we don't have to work on them. We just replace them. But, on the other hand, I mean, maybe it's kind of wasteful and we're losing out on kind of understanding our bikes from a different level. Do you think one way is better than the other, or are they kind of good trade-offs to have?
Well, from a purist perspective, which, I mean, I've always kept everything as long as I possibly could and always make everything as long as I can possibly make whatever it is, clothing, cars, anything,
Yeah.
Bikes are no exception. And I do find it frustrating, like with a ski binding, that break one little dinky part on the ski binding and there's nothing you can do. And but on the other hand, in terms of your time invested, if your main focus is on riding the bike, then you can get back on the bike much faster with today's bikes, because you just replace this whole modular unit, whatever it is that was failing, boom, put it back in. And removing cranks, for instance, is a lot quicker process.
Right.
So I can't say one's better than the other.
Right. Yeah, there's trade-offs either way. And like you mentioned, depends on kind of who you are and where you have that trade-off between time and money and where your interests lie in terms of biking. I mean, I think for a lot of people, it is about just being able to get out and ride again as quickly as possible. And at the same time, there are those who enjoy tinkering and, figuring that stuff out. So I want to talk about building bikes for tall riders. How did you get into building mountain bikes and bicycles for taller folks?
Well, I told you that story about coming down the descents in the Durango Silverton Iron Horse race and shimmying like mad. Well, that's a function of being tall.
Okay.
I've always been a pretty lean guy. At the time, I was 6'6" and 156 pounds.
Oh, wow.
And the taller the bike, the more torsional flex it has. I mean, that's probably that it just can't control the twisting motion very well. Bikes were all bikes had the same diameter tubing because it was all lug construction. So the lugs dictated not only that the tubes were round, but also what size they were, and those were really quite skinny. At the time, that's just what bikes looked like. But now you look at bikes like that and you're like, whoa, what skinny little tubes.
Right.
Really control the bike from twisting back and forth too much. And I knew from a physics perspective, basically to shimmy, that high-speed shimmy is a resonance frequency phenomenon where, whatever you're hitting on the road, the little bumps and the wind and whatever environmental effects that you're dealing with are at a similar frequency to the frequency vibration of the frame, the frequency of twisting one back and forth oscillation. And the bigger the frame, the longer that period so the lower the frequency, because it takes longer to twist it back and forth in one twisting thing, whereas a small, much higher frequency, shorter period of oscillation. And so you'd never encounter the environmental effects that would make a small frame do that. So that was really the impetus, was like, Jesus Christ, these guys don't know anything about big people. Because, at the time, everybody was racing on an Italian bike, and Italians are smaller people than Northern Europeans. And so that was how it started. And then as time progressed, initially I sponsored a women's racing team for a decade or so. And so for a long time, that was a really good market for me, making really small bikes for women, because there were bikes for women in the 80s. If you were a small person, you ended up like on a kid's bike kind of a thing. And it was a bike of similar quality to the high-end racing bikes, any of the big manufacturers. And so So I had a very loyal following among women bike racers. But then at some point, the big companies just realized that women actually spend a lot of money on bike stuff.
Right.
So they started initially, those attempts at women specific designs were just literally shrink it and pink it, and it didn't provide a good performance advantage. But now, it's not only everybody's small at some point in their life. So even,
right.
Kids in kids races are riding some pretty sweet bikes these days, So that whole market kind of dried up for me, but the tall bike market was just a natural, obviously, being so tall myself and I just sort of veered that way. And then as time went on, it just, now, I of course build bikes for any size people, but just don't have any competition in that niche.
Yeah. That's interesting that it sounds like the first kind of the impetus for that was actually like structural, for lack of a better term. I mean, the performance of the bike just wasn't what you wanted or what you would expect as a tall rider. What about like the bike fit? Are there challenges to fitting a taller rider? Like what are the things that you need to do that are maybe a little bit different for a tall rider than somebody who's more average height?
Well, yes. If you're sticking with stock components, which is what I would have been when I was racing on national team, Eddie B was the national team coach at the time. He did the fitting for me, and I had 180 millimeter cranks, which I'd gone to great lengths to find at the time. And it just made sense to me that I should have the longest cranks that you could make.
Right.
And he said, "Oh, you need longer cranks." And I'm like, "They don't make any longer than this." He's like, "Oh, sure, they make, he was a race, so he spoke kind of funny. But they didn't. And there was no other alternative for me other than the 180 millimeter. But even that, most other riders are like, "Oh my God, 180 millimeter, that's long and everything." But, if you think of it as a percentage of leg length, my inseam is almost 1,000 millimeters and the crank is 180 millimeters. So that's 18% of my leg length.
Okay.
Well, most people on a 172.5 millimeter crank with a 820 millimeter inseam, that's like 22%.
Yeah.
And so that means that the taller rider on the stock size crank, the angles that the hip and knee are going through are much less than the angles smaller person with a much higher percentage of their leg length being in the crank is going through. So that means that one thing it means is that the angle between the hip and the thigh when the foot is at the top of the crank circle, that angle at the hip is more open on the tall rider.
Okay.
That they can fold over further, so that that you definitely see in the pro ranks when you see really tall guys in the Tour de France. There's this tremendous amount of drop from their saddle to their handlebars.
Right.
Is maybe 6 to 10 inches, huge amount that most never tolerate. Well, it's a function of the fact that crank is disproportionately short compared to their leg length that allows them to fold over that far. It's not that there's anything different about the physiology of a really tall person that they can fold over more. It's just that coming high toward their chest. And that's what most fitters are dealing with when they're fitting tall, is they're fitting them with standard size cranks. And so that's a fundamental difference, is that you'd be like, whoa, you can have a whole lot of drop from the saddle to the bar. Other issues are that as the saddle goes, the seat angle is angled somewhere, 73 degrees, 72 degrees, something like that on most bikes. And as the seat goes angled up more and more and more, and it gets taller and taller, that means that the seat is literally further and further back over the rear wheel.
Right.
Which the bike's going to tend to wheelie. And, you have tall riders. That's a problem all the time on road bikes. It's certainly on mountain bikes, but also on road bikes, just of being in the saddle, pedaling hard, and the front wheel gets super light.
Yeah. Mountain bikers might like that. Some of us. I'm tall and I wish I could do better wheelies.
Yeah.
But That's a personal problem.
Definitely advantages for climbing on technical terrain. On mixed terrain, it's definitely an advantage to have decent traction with your front tire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a tall rider fundamentally feels more vulnerable to, they're just higher off the ground.
Right.
Feel more vulnerable in, sort of high siding situations and dropping down steep things, of feeling like they're more likely to pitch over because there's
right.
so much of them sticking up in the air. And so, that was something that didn't exist, of course, when I first wrote Zinn and the Art of Mountain Bike Maintenance, is the dropper posts, which
oh, right.
Giant boon to tall riders.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, talking about crank links, I think you started making custom crank links in like 2008. And I saw that you have some that are as long as 220 millimeters long. What is like the limit, would you say, for mountain biking specifically in terms of like a long crank and, getting hung up on rocks and things like that?
Well, the limitation for getting hung up on rocks is the combination of the crank length and the bottom bracket height.
True. Yep.
If you make the bike, design the bike for the longer crank, then you don't have any different clearance issues. I mean, that's what we do with our bikes. Both the Zinn custom ones and the Clydesdales are designed with quite a bit higher bottom bracket than standard because we're planning on the pedal at the bottom of the stroke being no lower to the ground than
I see
average bike would have.
Right.
So from that perspective, obviously if you're just buying a crank from us and sticking it on your existing bike, yeah, you're going to have some clearance. You don't want to go up very much, maybe 10 millimeters on crank length for that reason. From the perspective of, there are some fundamental things that people don't think about that a long crank really benefits a mountain biker. And one is when you're descending in technical terrain, feet are much further apart. You have a much longer stance.
Oh, right.
Supporting you. And so the, just like you don't, if you're playing football and somebody's zooming at you, you don't keep your feet close together to avoid getting knocked over. You put your
right.
Increase the length of your stance so that you can brace. And so when you're standing out of the saddle and descending technical stuff, it's great having that long platform.
Right.
And a long sustained climb is also, assuming you have the legs long enough to handle the long crank, you have tremendous leverage and it's great. And then those single, like what we were talking about, like when you're wheelie up a little bit and do a single oomph over a rock or a root or a stump or something, that's benefited by standing out on the end of a long crank and making that one stroke really make a difference. Where I think it's not a great thing is when there's with a mountain bike, there's much more change in cadence.
Right.
Dropping down into gullies and up and down and, all that sort of stuff. And to be able to spin up and down in terms of cadence, that's enhanced with a shorter crank.
Okay.
It depends on your physiology, your style of riding, and the kind of rides that you do. Even though, like a downhiller, a lot of that's coasting and would benefit from this longer stance. On the other hand, all this spinning up and spinning down, that's
right.
And so on balance, I think a downhiller is going to be better off with a shorter crank.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. How tall is the tallest rider you've built a bike for?
7'2".
7'2". Wow. Was that particularly difficult, or are you able to kind of scale up what you do for riders of other heights?
Well, yeah, it's particularly difficult. To make that bike not shimmy, you got to use enormously large diameter tubes. You know, when I started this business, even mountain bikes had level top tubes. Seat tubes were a lot longer for a given height of handlebar. If you have a level top tube, your seat tube's a lot longer. Standover height is
right.
Sort of stuff. And you know, BMX bikes were the only bikes with a sloping top tube back then. And then fortunately mountain bikes really pushed a lot of things that benefited everybody and that are benefiting everybody in all types of bikes now, whether it's road, gravel, cyclocross, track, everything. And those are getting away from lugs because people wanted the sloping top tube and wanted all these different angles that didn't exist in lugs. Once you have lugs, then you can go to welded construction or fillet braze construction like we were doing at Tom Ritchey's. Allows you to use different tube shapes, different tube diameters, any angle you want, all that sort of thing. So those are things, all of which I took advantage of. We were the first ones to use a 1 1/8 inch diameter steering tube on a road bike because that mountain bikes, and it made sense for tall riders that we wanted to have a bigger head tube so that we got a bigger top tube, bigger down.
Right.
It wouldn't twist and be so flimsy. And shortening the seat tube and sloping the top tube meant that for the same effective horizontal top tube, the actual tube was shorter until it gets to become a perpendicular bisector. The shortest distance between those lines, you know, between those points is reduced by dropping that top tube. And, you know, the stiffness of anything, the stiffness of a tube or anything goes as the cube of its length. So if you can decrease the length of the tube, but have the same effective fit, then you've made a huge difference in the stiffness. And so those are things that and then also incorporating more of the height of the seat height in the crank length means that we could shorten the seat tube from the bottom too, raising the bottom bracket higher, which shortens the tube as well and shortens the chainstays a little bit too. And so every tube we're able to make shorter other than the head tube. And that bigger and bigger, and then we make the seat tube as big as we can, so we can use the, you know, again, mountain bikes push the limits with the diameters of the seat posts, and we could get posts that were stiff enough, even though there was a lot more of it sticking out of the bike. But the limitation, you know, and back in the day, we were making the forks too, so it wasn't really how tall the bike got. But then once everybody wanted a carbon fork, then you're limited by the length of the, and with a mountain bike, it's a suspension fork. Then you're limited by the length of the steering tube that the manufacturer, which on mountain bikes is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. It's getting hard to deal with that problem for really tall bikes because Fox just this past year again just shortened all the tubes so much, and it's just like, it's very frustrating.
Why is that? I mean, because that's something that people are going to cut anyway. So it seems like they could just make it as long as they want. Or do you actually have to adjust where the taper portion of it is?
Oh, it's entirely to save money on this material, and you're smaller. Everything, you know, your warehouse space is greater because the boxes aren't as big. All that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Seems like not a big advantage. Yeah, they're saving a few pennies, but making it tough on the tall riders.
And then early suspension forks actually had pinch bolts that pinched the crown onto the steering tube. So, you know, anything like that is long since gone. You know, they're gonna make these assemblies of the fork crown and steering tube in massive quantities, and they're not we'll make a couple thousand of them with a longer steer. That's just not going to happen. And and so with carbon forks, finally, after 3 years of development, we just come up with our own fork, which we went way beyond the ISO standards. You know, ISO sets these standards for safety. To be able to sell a fork, you have to show that it withstands a certain number of cycles at a certain load level, and different things on the brake. Now with the disc brake, that part of the fork is particularly vulnerable because it's trying to, break the bottom of the left leg off, basically. The brake is, and this, steering tube, there's all these things required by ISO. But since we're making bikes for really huge people, and the ones that we want to have these, we have a 500 millimeter long steering tube on that fork. Well, 300 millimeters is standard now, maybe 350 now with gravel bikes. That's become so. But we know that not only people buying our bikes with those are very heavy, but the people that are likely to buy those as aftermarket are going to be really tall. The taller you are, the heavier you're going to be. And then using it on a stock size bike, then they're going to be stacking up a bunch of spacers too. So a lot of that steering tube unsupported above the top headset cup is all those things keep me awake at night. And so we went beyond, we took the ISO standards and went 50% higher and made the fork handle all these things. So we had to, everything if you ever see the fork, you'll see it's just a lot bigger blades than you see on anybody else's carbon fork. And the wall thickness of the steering tube is greater. Since we don't get to change that diameter, that's fixed by the headsets and everything. Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you mentioned too, taller riders tend to be heavier. And so you also design bikes for big riders. And so is that kind of the same approach and the same thing that you're looking at in terms of like the strength of the frame and those sorts of things for heavier riders?
Yes. And we've been through the ringer with this over the 40 years, We have a few 6'8", 350 pound customers who, even though 350 pounds, they can put enormous number of miles on their bikes and go right way up in the mountains. And they don't seem to, maybe they drop for a while over the summer to 320 or something, but it's not like they're dropping 200 pounds. They're just big men and incredibly strong. And all these things just wouldn't think would happen, but where they'll, the torque is extremely high in a really low gear. So people are probably familiar with that with mountain bikers with braking chains and things like that in a gear. Yeah. But when you go to, really small front chainring and really large rear cog and you stomp on that, the torque at the rear wheel is tremendous. Well, if you're 350 pounds and you can put out 2,000 watts of power, well, you're going to find that these guys will rip the spokes right out of the hub flange or yank the spoke nipples right out of the rims, or they'll just break the free hub body so that the freewheel just spins straight forward. All the kind of things that you hear about happening with people on tandems. People on a tandem weigh about the same as one of these guys, Their power is probably similar. And so the braking issues, all those sorts of things. I mean, we have a customer who would, 6'8", 350 pound customer who would go on 6-week long tours in the Pyrenees and the Alps and stuff. And when the disc brakes came out, he thought that was great because he was no longer exploding the tires because his rims would get brakes, Ooh. Well, he was the original Shimano road disc brakes. He was going through pads every single day.
Oh my goodness.
Replacing pads every day. And so things have improved, things have gotten better, but the kind of stuff that these guys deal with, most people don't have any idea about. And so when we say with our Glidesdale bikes that, these will take riders up to 450 pounds, we really mean it. And it's we select all the components and we know the frame's going to take it and we know the fork's going to take it, but we also, we don't put parts on there, the seat posts and the stems and the handlebars and the hubs and the rims and the spokes and everything. We thought thought about in terms of what's going to happen. And, we have, anecdotally heard about guys who are trying to, live a healthier life. They get into their 40s and 50s and they discovered that they're 500 pounds, and they realize there's no such thing as an 80-year-old that's 500 pounds.
Right.
If you want to live on, you got to do something about it. And so they'll be too embarrassed to be seen out riding bulk, hanging off the bike. So they go like 2 a.m. Well, you have a guy riding at 2 a.m. who breaks a bunch of crap on his bike. He's not going to be up very long if he's got to call his
right
at 2 a.m. to rescue him. And so that's the kind of, at the end point of the customers that we're thinking of, that we want to make sure that these things hold up to them and that they don't have to,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine a lot of this is applicable to like more aggressive bikes, like mountain bikes in particular, and downhill, like you were kind of mentioning. I mean, those bikes need to be very strong, very reliable. And yeah, it seems like a lot of that, there's a lot of crossover between the two.
There is. We've certainly benefited from the existence of those extreme uses of the bike. Of downhill, has created the development of wider hubs, for instance, that can support the structure better and stronger free hub bodies and spoke technology, like spokes. I think people, like the spokes that you see on a lot of, or used to see, I don't know, I haven't looked at wheelchairs in a long time, but it used to be wheelchairs always had these really, really thick 12 gauge spokes. And that, that was sort of the assumption you made with, if you were on a really, really strong wheel, you're going to get a really, really fat spoke. Well, if you look at downhillers' wheels, they're not like that. They're double butted spoke. And the reason is that you want, if the spoke is too stiff, it puts much more strain on the rim because as you put a tremendous load on that wheel, and as it rolls along, it gets slightly D-shaped at the bottom. Well, if the spoke isn't able to sort of stretch a little bit and move with that, then it loses contact. The spoke nipple loses contact with the rim for that instant. It gets flattened out. And then when it comes past the bottom dead center, it springs back and it goes whap against the spoke nipple. And constant boom, 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 which fatigues a rim really fast and ends up cracking all the drive side spoke nipples. And so, whereas a double butted spoke, you'd think, well, they make that for lightness. Well, they make that for actually longevity of the wheel too. That spoke can then stretch and move with the wheel. You get a longer lasting wheel. And so all these things that we see happening in downhill help us. And of course, when the fork steers get ridiculously short, our only alternative for really tall people is to use a super long travel fork because we can't get a long enough steer tube. So thank God those exist,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, given sort of your background and knowledge of physics, I mean, it's clear the way you describe these things, that you're looking at it from that physics perspective. And one of the topics that I know you've written a good bit about is bike tire rolling resistance. And so I'm curious to know, I think a lot of our listeners too want to know, like, what are kind of the main factors that influence a bike tire's rolling resistance?
Well, I'd say there's 4 things. One is something you can do something about, which is tire pressure.
Yeah.
The other is built into the tire. So one is the casing, one is the tread compound, and one is the tread design.
And is that sort of the order that it goes to, like in terms of importance?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it could be argued between tread design, and if the tread design is really huge, have really big knobs compared to obviously that's going to absorb more energy. So
right,
gray area there. The other thing is tire diameter.
Okay.
So the casing is really critical because, it's cheaper to make a tire with much thicker threads in the cord,
Okay. Yeah.
the casing. And, and if the carcass of the tire, it's listed in TPI, threads per inch. So if you have a TPI, it means that those threads are fat, because if they're stacked
Right.
each other, not very many threads are going to fit in 1 inch. And so, and that means if the thread is thicker, it's going to be stiffer. So as that casing encounters a bump, if the threads can't move properly with it, then the casing, the casing is stiffer, which means that it will force the entire bike and rider up. Where a much more supple one with much thinner threads in the casing, it will be able to absorb that at the same tire pressure. It will be able to absorb more of that bump, and it will lift the rider less, which obviously the more you lift the bike and rider, that was energy that assuming, except when you're going downhill, when you're going uphill or flat, that energy came out of the rider's legs.
Right.
And the more that you send the bike up and down, the more that's just energy lost that the rider put the bike up to that speed. And back when I was racing on national team, we believed that, the bike just felt really lively when you pumped the tires like to 135 pounds. You had these really skinny 19 millimeter tires, 135 pounds, and it felt like it was really felt really fast because it was really bouncy, but it was the
right,
because it was bouncing along the road, and you were wasting all this energy that could have been absorbed in the tire if you'd had a bigger tire at lower pressure. Even with casing construction and everything, you could have gone much faster. And it's a shame that I didn't realize that back then.
Yeah, right. It is kind of counterintuitive. And it's interesting because I think for a lot of us, we tend to focus on the tread pattern and just, we think we can look at a tire and have an idea of like whether it's going to roll fast or not. But it sounds like there are a lot of factors involved, and some of them maybe are even more important than the tread pattern itself.
Yes. And another thing also, so basically your thread per inch, but you kind of got to look at the casing, just get a sense of looking at casings and looking at, those are really fine threads, because some manufacturers, a tire is made, a standard clincher tire, the casing starts basically on one side and it wraps around the bead, right over the side of the tire, around the bead, up over the top of the tire, around the bead, on the other side, back across the center. So that means you got 3 layers of casing, and on the sides, you got 2 layers of casing.
Okay.
So threads per inch is supposed to be the number of threads per inch in one layer of that casing. But some tire manufacturers, because they know that people don't buy their tires, because if they know that the threads per inch, they'll say, they'll multiply it by 3, because they'll say, well, under the tread, it's 7 times 3 or whatever that is, 200 is the and so you go, wow, that's a 200 TPI. This 200, it's not an apples to apples comparison. So you need to get a sense for looking at the casing and seeing, and you can feel it too. You go into a store and you feel a cheap tire, and you just feel the casing, what that feels like compared to a really expensive one for the same application. Say it's cross country, it's a little different downhill where you're trying to have more toughness of the tire, but for a really fine, fast cross-country tire is going to have a really supple casing. And you also, generally, the casing will be thinner then because of thinner threads as well, which means that it will also be lighter, which that's another benefit. But then the tread compound is something that you cannot look at. You cannot tell how fast a tire is.
Right.
How tread compound is by looking at it. It's just, and in general, what I will say is that, as the CAFE standards, which are the standards, the mileage standards that the government sets for cars, as the CAFE standards get higher, one of the things that the car manufacturers do is put greater pressure on the tire manufacturers to make faster rolling tires to bring, to save them having to do as much engineering of the engine and whatever to get that
right,
that better.
Yeah.
And so that's why the tire brands that are known to have really fast tread compounds, often they're German guys doing it who started it, because Continental is one of the only brands in the bike business that is a car tire brand as well as it's a premium car tire brand that's been under pressure from the car manufacturers to get lower rolling resistance. So then they have all these engineers who've really worked on these tread compounds, because the fundamental thing is called hysteresis. It's basically, if you have a super ball and you drop it, the thing that makes it a super ball is it'll bounce almost as high as it.
Right.
That means it's got very low hysteresis. So as it goes through a cycle of elasticity, of being deformed and then returning to its original shape, very little is lost. Most rubber balls are not super balls. That's why super balls are called super.
Yeah, that's why they're super.
And so the same thing goes with a tread compound, that as the tread gets deformed by the road, how much energy is lost in heating that compound versus how, before it returns to its original shape. And so, but if you took a super ball compound and put it on a tire, there'd be very little hysteresis loss. On the other hand, it would probably be really poor traction too, because it'd be too. So there's this balancing act you have to go through. And what all done with tires, bike tires, was they, sort of took available rubbers, and that's just the deal you got. You picked a softer rubber if you wanted better traction. Well, the softer rubber is going to be slower rolling because you got more hysteresis loss. So then it wasn't until, all these smart guys started figuring out all these different compounding things they could do where you could get a little bit of both. You could have it soft, still have lower hysteresis loss. And so Continental, then Schwalbe and Specialized, take the engineers that Continental, and they develop, the Specialized Gripton thread. And, those were the guys that worked on the Continental Black Chili tread compound. And then you've got the one at Schwalbe, which I can't remember what that compound is called, but those are generally, in my testing. So I, for my articles for Velo News, I've done a lot of rolling resistance testing, sending to the best independent rolling resistance testing lab in the world, which is Wheel Energy in Nastoya, Finland. And those compounds, if you're able to make the other variables the same, compounds will rise to the top. The Continental Black Gripton and the Schwalbe, whatever it's called. And then the next thing is tread design, which, you have to, if you want the fastest rolling tire, then you're just going to make it click, but that's not going to give you much traction. So you have this trade-off of what you're, and the more tread you've got on it, the individual knobs are going to flex, and the more energy is going to be absorbed, the slower the tire will roll, the more rolling resistance it has.
Yeah. So finally, I want to ask you about your latest book, The Haywire Heart, which examines heart conditions in athletes. What led you to write about this subject?
Well, I developed a heart arrhythmia. I mean, endurance sports, and I tended to race year round. I raced cyclocross in the fall and winter. I raced early winter, and then I raced cross-country ski racing, doing these ski marathons all over the world. out into March, and then I'd be doing, in training for cyclocross, I'd be doing a number of hill climbs and road races, some mountain bike races. And I was under the impression that I think a lot of masters endurance athletes are, that if you're 55 and you're beating all the 35-year-olds, that you're somehow immune from your body falling apart in ways that you didn't expect. And, you know, just like, even though you're 55 and you're super fit, you grab your skin on your hand and it's super thin, and compared to a baby or then even a 20-year-old, you know, kind of process is happening all over your body, that you're losing the elasticity of your tissues all over your body.
Wow.
And with your heart, you know, if you're a 20-year-old and you ask for this tremendous amount of blood volume from your heart in order, because you're going to, you know, do all sorts of endurance training and racing, or you're going to climb Mount Everest without oxygen, or whatever you're going to do, your heart will get bigger in response to that. And, you know, and the things that we all know about, where your resting heart rate goes down because you're pushing out so much blood with each pump that you're lower heart rate, and all these things that we associate with being better fitness and all that.
Right.
If you're 20 and you then detrain yourself and go, you stop doing those things, your heart will return to its original shape.
Okay.
In your 50s, 60s, and you're asking for that similar kind of blood volume, in answering that demand to get bigger, your heart being less flexible, there will be micro tearing that's going to be happening in the heart in order like that. And then as that heals, there will be scarring in the heart. You'll have little scars in there. The way the heart, the electrical impulse moves through moves through the heart to cause the contraction, it moves like a smooth wave across it. And if you water moving smoothly across sand, like flowing smoothly across sand, and then you throw a rock in it, it will suddenly get eddy currents around that rock. You'll get, and that's the same thing that happens with this scarring that's happening in your heart, that the electrical current can't just move through smoothly. There will be eddy currents formed around these things, and that's the substrate for arrhythmia. And some of these arrhythmias can be very, very dangerous. Ventricular tachycardia being one that's what killed Phidippides when he came and ran to bring the news of the Battle of Marathon, you know?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Marathon, not because the Greeks, the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, we know the word marathon because Phidippides died running 26.2 miles to bring the news of that. And we think of him as having been he just didn't know how to pace himself. Well, he was a full 43-year-old full-time running messenger. That's what he did. Ran.
Okay.
He was the quintessential masters endurance athlete, and he died of VTAC from that. And so anyway, most arrhythmias are more mellow. Atrial fibrillation, you're not going to die from, but it's going to cause you other problems. You can get a stroke from it and things like that. And when I developed the arrhythmia, I looked around and realized some of the guys that I've been racing with, particularly cross-country ski racing, who just disappeared. And there was this rumor about them. They'd been super, super fast, and all of a sudden they were just gone. I was like, how could they stop doing this? They're so good.
Yeah. And
there had been these rumors about something with their heart. And then, I followed up with them, like, what happened with you? And it was all arrhythmias. And there was no data in this country. That's why I wrote the book, because any data, American data at the time about arrhythmias was all on, cardiac patients. These are people that the risk factors, smoking, diabetes, overweight, lack of exercise, all those sorts of things. But in Scandinavia, there were studies done of over 50,000 people each of people doing these two ski races I used to do. One in Sweden called the 90K, called the Vasaloppet, and the other 65K called the Birkebeiner Rennet in Norway. And those studies showed that they had 30% higher incidence of competitors in that race had 30% higher incidence of atrial fibrillation than the rest of the Scandinavian population.
Oh, wow.
Secondly, the faster they were, the higher the rate of atrial fibrillation. And thirdly, the more times they'd done the race, the higher the rate of atrial fibrillation. These races,
Oh, my goodness.
16,000 people do them each year, so you could follow a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so that was very eye-opening for me, and that's what got me to write that book, because I was like, people need to know this. This is,
Yeah.
People who are overweight and couch potatoes are shunned by our society.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get acknowledged when they go to parties for, wow, that's so awesome how gotten and how little exercise you do. But the person
Right.
in their 50s and 60s and they're winning bike races, they're like, wow, that's amazing. You're just,
Yeah.
but the risk factor is similar, in
Yeah.
the U-shaped curve of activity level versus morbidity. You have very high morbidity at very low activity levels, but then as you
Mm-hmm.
increase your activity level, it comes down to where, but the trough where your lowest morbidity tends to be, people maybe walking an hour a day, not people doing, extreme exercise.
Right.
Starts going back up again and never reaches maybe as high as the other side of the U, but you get similar morbidity from continuing beyond the throttle your whole life. So
Yeah. Well, so in writing the book and doing that research, did that cause you to change your habits or your fitness routine or anything?
it sure did, because my arrhythmia is something called multifocal atrial tachycardia, which
Okay.
feels like a fish flopping around in my chest when I go into the arrhythmia, but I have AFib, which AFib is where it's a uncontrolled, what's the word for it? Just random vibrating atria of the upper chambers of the heart,
Okay.
which tends to allow clots to happen on the top of the surface of the blood, and those clots can be sent to your brain and get a stroke. And
Oh, my goodness.
and so the way that that's combated is by they give you anticoagulants, blood thinners,
Mm-hmm.
to prevent that from happening. Well, you can't be a mountain biker and be on blood thinners, because
Right.
hit your head, you can have a closed bleed inside your head that won't stop, and you'll die from it. Similar, bang your hip really hard and you end up with a bruise that won't end, And so,
Yeah.
so I don't want any of those things.
Right.
I, for instance, I certainly no longer race at anything.
Mm-hmm.
I cross-country skiing, I no longer skate at altitude. I just classic ski or
Okay.
do now most of the time is backcountry ski, and not with 30-year-olds. I go with people my age, where you're just plodding up a mountain, and rather than always being the first one to the top like I used to be, I'm always the last one. Yeah. And as far as bike riding, I still want to go on these great rides in the mountains, but if I do on a regular bike, I go into arrhythmia. So I ride an e-bike, and that's
Okay.
tremendous boon for my business too, because I started building e-bikes 5 years ago in order to make one for myself, and huge head start on everybody, all the other, because we've been doing it for a while. We understand it. We know how to make e-bikes. We're we just know all about it. And now it's become a big thing in this country. It's been big for a long time, but it's starting to be big in this country. And there's the user conflicts that are happening with trail access and stuff in mountain biking that we'll be dealing with for some time to go. But it's opened up this whole thing to me, and that all these climbs that I used to do 1,000 times, that I've done some of these climbs around here. And now I notice things that I never noticed before. Riding, oh, look at the grain in that granite on this road cut.
Yeah.
How they put that there? Well, it's always because you were going so hard. So
Yeah.
in quality of life, I'm not regretting it. I mean, it's really quality of life, and I'm doing the things I want to do. They're just different, and I think I'm going to last longer because I've made those changes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Lennard, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us. You're a wealth of knowledge on a number of topics, and yeah, thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, you can find out more about Zinn Cycles on the website, zinncycles.com, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.